had the lunchtime slot at a few gatherings that we've had, and I'm sure at other places. But look, I'm very pleased to introduce our keynote speaker, Jared Bernstein, who's going to help expand the discussion we've had today and offer a view informed by White House deliberations and his own work tracking the performance of the economy and its impact on families up and down the income ladder. Jared is chief economist and economic advisor to Vice President Biden. He's also executive director of the Middle Class Task Force, which was created by President Obama and is chaired by Vice President Biden. And in these capacities, he weighs in on extremely consequential policy debates. Perhaps he'll let us know which debates he won, which ones he's lost, and where he plans to fight another day. He is an expert on a wide range of economic and policy topics, including mobility, inequality, trends in employment earnings, labor markets, international comparisons, and also, importantly, the impact of policies at the state and local level, some of the things we've been talking about today. So given his focus and his insightful commentary, I'm very glad that he's often in the room when they're talking about economic policy around the White House table. Sometimes I wish there were more of him. I'm not sure we could do some creative cloning, but the reason is because well before Jared got to the White House, I was an avid consumer of his work. When he was at the Economic Policy Institute, he was a longtime author and co-editor of one of the essential texts of policy analysis, The State of Working America, multiple volumes, but it would come out with new data, new commentary, tracking the trends in the economy and explaining how households were faring in our dynamic economy. Among some of the books he's written, one was called Crunch, Why Do I Feel So Squeezed? He was an early observer of the yo-yo economy. You know, the one where you're on your own, yo-yo. And he, it might not have caught on with all the talking heads, but certainly anyone looking at changes in the social contract and social policy delivery systems knew what he was talking about and the way risk was shifting. He proposed, of course, and I think we would have been much better off if we had heeded him at the time, that we should be creating a WIT economy. You know, the one where we're all in this together. But of course, we're kind of in that one now, since some of the sectors of the economy have dragged us down. And if we can get the economy growing again in ways that fully engage the citizenry, provide necessary protections, and broadly share our prosperity, you know, that will be the challenge, that we can overcome the drag of the Great Recession. So we're interested in learning from this experience and not letting it be a debilitating legacy. So we're going to ask Jared how we do that. He's going to share his insights and some of the overriding questions of the day. So thank you for joining us, sharing your remarks, and then he'll handle some questions from the podium. Thanks.
Well, thank you. Thanks for that nice introduction. And I actually talk about yo-yos and wits today a little bit. So that's a good lead-in. And Reed, it's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Just for the record, your work with the New America Foundation on the Assets Program is something that's been influential with my thinking before I got to the White House, but recently was cited in a meeting at the White House. So your stuff is penetrating and very important. I also am very happy to be here looking at the lists of panelists and seeing a few folks on my way in, a lot of old friends, and I very much look forward to having a conversation with you after my remarks. So I'll try to talk for around 20 minutes or so, and then we can have a discussion. I was very much intrigued by the subject of this meeting, the social contract after the Great Recession, because it combines things I've been thinking about for years, really for decades. And in fact, I find once you start thinking in terms of social contracts, it's kind of hard to stop. The other day, my 11-year-old daughter was telling me about how, because of a couple of troublemakers, they now have to have a teacher escort them back to the classroom after band practice, whereas before they were trusted to walk back to the class without supervision. The shame, if you can think back, of such treatment is apparently like a perp walk for a fifth grader. But it did generate a good discussion as to what such an arrangement implies for their social contract in their class, and how under this contract the best outcomes depend on each being responsible for not simply their own behavior, but for that of their peers as well. Now, the other focus of the conference, the Great Recession, has of course been at the heart of our work since the Obama economic team's very first meeting in Chicago, December 2008. I remember it well. We were at the high floor of some building in downtown Chicago with the president-elect and the vice president-elect, and the first time the meeting came together around the team came together around a big table. The snow was starting to fall, and we began this discussion about what was going on in the economy. It was portentous, and we haven't stopped talking about that and working on it since. So once again, New America has brought together two extremely compelling topics. Philosophers have thought about this notion of a social contract from at least the days of Socrates. Typically, they frame the contract as a consensus wherein the majority agrees to abide by a set of rules. They agree because absent those rules, they and their property and their families would be in danger. As Hobbes put it, the contract must, quote, overawe the state of nature. Adam Smith, a profound social contractarian, built classical economics upon this foundation, showing how disparate individuals pursuing their personal goals within a capitalist system, that is, a monetary system where the players have some personal skin in the game, create optimal economic outcomes. So absent the contract, not only do average folks fail to get a fair shake, but society in the aggregate is worse off. So it's bad for micro and for macro. Evidence for this simple but essential point is seen in dictatorial or worse systems where the social contract has been voided by the few so that they may control the many. Such abrogation of the social contract has brought us some of history's darkest times, which is simply by way of saying that this stuff is really important. The stakes are high and we need to get it right. As Reed mentioned, I explored the idea of social contracting from an economic perspective in my book, Altogether Now Common Sense for a Fair Economy. At the time, it was in the mid-2000s, there was a strong sense of contrast in the air between two different versions of the contract. Hoping to create acronyms that might catch on, I labeled these visions WIT and yo-yo. Now, the fact that you've never heard of these acronyms tell you all you need to know about my marketing skills, but I rehearsed the arguments today not only because I think they were important in the 2000s, and especially in the election won by President Obama, but also because I think they are very much again in the air. Yo-yo stood for You're on Your Own and was intended to bring to mind the political economy of privatizing current non-market functions, defunding government, deregulating markets based on the principle that they would then self-regulate, opposing collective bargaining, public education, public goods in general. Yo-yoism makes for a narrow social contract. Now, this all may sound abstract and dated, though rational market theorists apparently still lurk about in large Midwestern cities. But it's not. It's not dated. Contemporary yo-yos still argue for privatizing Social Security and Medicare. They inveigh against financial reform and oppose standing up a Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. They aggressively want to defund government, as seen in their Pledge to America, which implies cuts of 20% in key services such as education, yet still manages to add well over $1 trillion to the 10-year budget deficit. They argue for repealing health care reform. You're on your owners have no patience for rules that cover pre-existing conditions, increased coverage for children and young adults, anti-rescission rules, free preventive care, and so on. At the other end of the social contract continuum, we have the WITs. We're in this together, which obviously implies a broader social contract. So as the 2000s progressed, the weaknesses of the yo-yo social contract began to be revealed. Though productivity growth proceeded apace, working families in the middle class were running harder yet falling behind. Job growth was anemic, the worst, in fact, of any business cycle on record. The Wall Street Journal of all papers recently wrote about this under the heading, quote, the lost decade for family income. Can you pass me my water? Yet huge gains, this is the 2000s, yet huge gains accrued to households at the top of the income scale who enjoyed not only massive pre-tax income growth, but significantly lower tax rates. Inequalities hit levels not seen since the late 1920s. So as they campaigned, candidates Obama and Biden heard, in so many words, a fundamental critique of the yo-yo social contract. Then came the Great Recession. Now, in the context of today's remarks, I view the Great Recession as the outcome of a failed social contract. For example, those at the highest levels of economic policy believed that markets would monitor themselves and then self-correct if any imbalances developed. It should now be clear to all of us that this view fails to account for realities clearly absent from the models, dynamics having to do with political power, regulatory capture, corporate governance, compensation structures. In other words, if your contract fails to account for political economics, for the role of adequate oversight, for the very simple Adam Smith principle that you need some skin in the game, there's got to be some market discipline for this thing to work, well, otherwise the center simply won't hold. It didn't. And we took office amidst the worst downturn since the Great Depression, which was arguably the last time the nation was forcefully reminded of the consequences of an inadequate social contract. It is no coincidence that the last time national income was as concentrated as it was in 2007, when just under 1/4 of national income was held by the top 1%, was in 1928. So the President acted with great speed to stop the economic freefall, signing the Recovery Act less than 4 weeks into his term and getting the ongoing interventions in financial markets onto a more efficient and accountable track. In the interest of time, I won't rehearse the statistical look back at what happened next, but the fact is that the loss rates of real GDP and jobs almost immediately slowed. The economy moved from contraction to expansion, I'm talking real GDP here, in mid-2009, and private sector job growth turned net positive in January of this year, where it's been since. That is not, by any means, the end of the story. The fact that you've turned around only means you're moving in the right direction. It doesn't mean you've arrived at your destination. Families are clearly still struggling, and we need to do all we can to build on the existing momentum, something the President and our economic team continues to focus on every day. I'm happy to talk during our Q&A about the implied policy agenda, the tax cuts targeted small businesses, new infrastructure investments, the push for jobs in manufacturing and clean energy. But for now, let me address the question of the day. What might be the nature of the social contract after the Great Recession? Here's how one person put it last week. Quote, "We know that government doesn't have all the answers to our problems. Government should be lean and efficient. But in the words of the first Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, we also believe that government should be there to help people do what they cannot do better for themselves. That means we believe in a country that rewards hard work and responsibility, but also a country where we give each other a hand up, where we look after one another, where we say, I am my brother's keeper, I am my sister's keeper. That's the America I know. That's the choice in this election." So that's President Obama, clearly aligning us with wits over yo-yos, saying in so many words that if we don't want to do the perp walk back from the band room, we'd better make choices that pull us together and move us forward, not backwards towards, in the words of Congressman Pete Sessions, head of the National Republican Congressional Committee, quote, "the exact same agenda," close quote, "that got us into this mess." So what does this mean in concrete terms? First, it means a rigorous analysis of government's role. In financial market reform, we've taken steps to protect taxpayers from one of the most damaging clauses of the yo-yo social contract, the one that says, heads we win, tails you lose. And we've got Liz Warren setting up a new agency to protect consumers from the damaging abuses that evolved in the go-go yo-yo years. In healthcare reform, we recognize that affordable and accessible health coverage is essential to well-being, and so the contract includes the kinds of guarantees I noted earlier against dropping coverage when folks need it the most, for example. But just as important, a responsible social contract must be forward-looking. And here I note healthcare reform's attack on our key source of fiscal unsustainability, the excess cost burden posed by healthcare costs. As scored by the nonpartisan CBO, cost controls will start bending the curve of healthcare cost growth in the first 10 years of implementation and bend it a lot further in the second decade. This brings me to my final point. It may not be sexy, but it is, I think, one of the most important pieces of the puzzle of reassembling a valid social contract. We must reestablish trustworthy institutions. Without them, we cannot have a viable social contract. Whether it's the government, the corporate sector, the financial, healthcare, or energy market, the educational system, our nation's institutions must be worthy of our trust and our support. We must believe, based on solid evidence, that these institutions are working to lift the country and the middle class, not working against them. I would further argue that here is where the worst of the damage was done by the yo-yos, and it's where the Obama administration has been working the hardest to repair the damage. In every case regarding those institutions just noted, we've tried to reestablish their function. In government, we've gone back to honest budgeting, to paying as you go, to administering our programs with a level of accountability and transparency heretofore unseen. In that regard, I was struck by one data point that came out of the Recovery Act's Accountability and Transparency Board. This is an independent oversight board, independent of the White House, run by Earl Devaney and other inspector generals. So these aren't our numbers. And this number, this data point, is merely a tiny, tiny microcosm of my larger point. But it's a revealing one, I think. Of the almost 200,000 contracts and subcontracts bid under the Recovery Act, there were only about 3,800 complaints of wrongdoing. That's 2% of the awards made. Of those complaints, only 424 out of almost 200,000 contracts and subcontracts triggered active investigations, and 141 cases have been closed without action. So the remaining 283 open investigations represent 0.2% of funding events, an historically tiny share. Now, I suspect that hardly anyone outside the Beltway and precious few inside know about this record, and I get that. I understand that. And I get that even if they did know, it probably wouldn't mean that much to them. But I raise it in this context to this group for one reason. It is but one small brick in the foundation of a return to good government. If our administration is given a chance to continue making the case, it will be through thousands of examples like this one that we turn the tide on the notion of government as expressed by the President in the quote I shared earlier. In other words, I see less a need to, quote, revise policy assumptions in the wake of the Great Recession, to cite today's conference title, than to reestablish faith among the electorate that our institutions, starting with government, can effectively and efficiently, quote, help people do what they cannot do better for themselves, as the President said. That they can help create and enforce the rules of the road that keep markets from going off the rails at taxpayer expense. That they can erase incentives for rampant speculation, that they can generate student-based educational reforms, that they can plant seed investments in growth sectors where markets will underinvest, that they can internalize external costs like those generated by carbon emissions or inefficient health care provision. Now, it's easy to tick off such lists, and we all, myself included, play a lot of chin music in this town, especially around election time. But the proof is in the doing. In stimulus that breaks the economic freefall, in the creating and saving of millions of jobs, in keeping teachers in the classroom and cops on the beat, in tax cuts that support families and businesses, in budgets that plot a course back to fiscal sustainability, in education reforms that support innovative approaches to teaching and learning, in long-term changes that bend the healthcare cost curve, protect taxpayers from future bailouts, protect consumers from unfair treatment, develop clean energy markets and jobs here at home, and so on. These are the clauses in our social contract, and it is, of course, by no means complete. We have much work left to do, especially from where I sit, on the economy and jobs for the middle class. And as you know, we have new ideas teed up in this space, from tax measures to help small businesses to building off of the infrastructure investments from the Recovery Act. But this is the agenda. This is the social contract that we are pursuing. It's already yielding positive results, and I'm deeply convinced that given the opportunity, we will not only continue to help this great nation stay solidly on track, we will someday soon once again be allowed to walk back to the classroom after band practice without supervision. Thank you.
So I'll sit down. Do you want to sit down? And I'll call out. Okay. We do have mics moving around. Jared will answer some questions. So wait for, I'm going to call on Jamie here first. I saw a hand go up. But if it's not Jamie who spoke earlier, you should identify yourself and ask a question. Thank you.
I'm James Galbraith, and like Reed Kramer, I'm affiliated with the University of Texas. Jared, you spoke of the need for trustworthy institutions, and I'm wondering whether you feel that the nation's largest commercial banks fall into that category today, largest banking institutions. Are you satisfied with their conduct and performance in the 2 years since the administration took office? Whether you think that the regulatory authorities have done an adequate job of enforcement, referrals to the Department of Justice on the practices that brought us the financial collapse, and whether the foreclosure fraud crisis that we're now seeing doesn't suggest that we need to have really aggressive action to change the behavior of this particular sector of our economy.
The banking sector includes a lot of different institutions. It is absolutely the case that some very large, key, influential members of that group not only behaved very badly, but took advantage of, I think, basically a yo-yo framework, to reference what I was talking about in my speech. Really a kind of an ideological moment in time where they really were able to play the heads we win, tails you lose game, and the economic consequences of the failure of that sector to perform in ways consistent with my comments of trustworthy institutions was a key factor in the financial meltdown and the ensuing Great Recession to which families are still suffering from. So, but there are, then again, there's lots of commercial banks on Main Street that are worthy institutions that played by the rules. So I think you have to be a little careful about who you're looping into, the banks. In terms of I think the foreclosure documentation problem that you mentioned is a great example of what we're trying to do to create, to once again, not only create a government worthy of trust and support, but also to enforce institutional trustworthiness. There were, without saying anything about the scope of the problem that's still, I think, being unfolded and understood, there were clearly practices that failed to follow the rule of law, and not just, by the way, in the robo-signing and all that. Clearly that was, on the affidavit side, problematic. But it's also incumbent upon these institutions, in many cases, to pursue loss mitigation before you go to foreclosure. And there are a set of arrangements that are designed to help people stay in their homes if they can, or if they can't, perhaps sell their home through a short sale or a deed in lieu of foreclosure. So those are options that, in many cases, banks are obligated to pursue before they pursue foreclosure. And Sean Donovan has has emphasized this. I think if you want to go deeper into this and see and read about what we're doing, and what there's a task force, a 20-agency task force that's looking into this. The Federal Housing Administration is drilling, and has been well before this, drilling deeply into the process when it comes to FHA-held mortgages. Go read the transcript from the press briefing that Sean Donovan and Mike Barr did just last week. It's really, I mean, it really is a good read, and it fits right in with this idea of the steps that we're taking to reestablish not only an effective government that intervenes in cases where institutions haven't lived up to their responsibilities, but what we're doing to try to enforce those institutional responsibilities.
Sure.
Hi, I'm Daniel. I work for an organization called Social Security Works, and we're fighting to prevent benefit cuts that may be recommended to Social Security. And I'll just, in terms of sort of in the background of what you were saying, is obviously sort of the political equation here, and the fact that we're potentially looking at a very hostile Congress and an environment in which the debt has taken the place of jobs and economic recovery as the most urgent policy goal, and including for many on the left. And I'm wondering sort of how the we're all in it together mentality can be applied to the way we look at the debt, rather than have it be used purely as, in my opinion, it is often unfortunately being used as a fear tactic to prompt us to further cut our social safety net and our social contract, and what you think that the administration will be doing toward that end.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. It's a good question. One of the things that came to mind as you were asking your question was I just remembered that after I wrote this book altogether now, somebody thought that this yo-yo and wit framing might be useful, and they went out and they polled it. And they found that the yo-yo framing actually is very effective. It was a good critical framing. But when it came to this wit idea, we're in this together, people basically said, well, who exactly am I in this with? So we've got some work to do. Look, I would point out that the jobs deficit or debt discussion has been, I think, hugely complicated and elevated beyond the reality which is the following. The president has articulated many times. It's kind of a, you got to walk and chew gum at the same time here. It shouldn't be that hard to recognize the need to, I guess it shouldn't be that hard to recognize the difference in short, medium, and long term, and how those issues all feed together here. In the short term, the best thing we can do to reduce the deficit is generate faster economic growth. In the medium term and the long term, we have to get our budget onto a sustainable path. That means, right now, doing two things. Continuing to focus on job-creating measures. And I mentioned a number of ones that we've already pursued. In fact, I could have gone through a much longer and far more boring list than I did. If you start adding the HIRE Act, some of the extensions of safety net programs, housing credits, and so on. I think we've tried to stress the critical importance, even as we go forward in a climate which I totally agree with you is very much focused on the deficit and the debt internationally. I mean, look at the UK right now. That we still need to do more. We still need to do more. And I think the key thing here, just to put on a budget wonk's hat for a minute, when your spending is temporary, truly temporary, its impact on the debt, on the deficit, is diminishingly small. So the Recovery Act, $787 billion program, but a temporary, so that, you know, large by historical standards, but a temporary program, a program that gets into the system 2 years later, is largely spent out. That program contributes less than 0.5%, including interest costs, to the deficit to GDP ratio in 2012 because of its temporary nature. And the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities has this great graph of the deficit increasing and not increasing factors through something like 2020, where they show measures like the Bush tax cuts, absorbing a huge chunk throughout the whole. These are, these were 10-year programs, and if you intended them to be permanent, the implications on the deficit are striking. Versus, say, the temporary spending. So short-term targeted jobs spending is completely consistent with the framework I've laid out. So I think we have to be we really have to be mindful of the exigencies of the moment and the necessities of budget sustainability over the longer term.
Yeah.
My name is Richard Benedict. I'm a retired U.S. ambassador and was responsible, among other things, for international environmental policy, Montreal Protocol, Ozone Protocol, and other things.
I think you need to speak up a little bit.
Yes.
Thank you.
Sorry, I have a sore throat.
Sorry.
International environmental policy and economic policies.
Oh, great.
And it was, I think, James Galbraith earlier and others have made reference to FDR and the New Deal in the Great Depression. And of course, he had many enemies. There were people, the oligarch classes were very much against what he was doing. But the interesting, in contrast to the situation today, was that the great masses of public opinion were in favor of the things that Roosevelt and the New Deal were trying to do to get us out of that economic mess. And now I find intriguing, and I'd like to have your comment on this, that politically, the very people, the lower middle and some middle classes, who are most hurt by the current situation, have at the same time become allies of the oligarch classes in opposing what the administration is trying to do, perhaps not doing enough in my mind, but maybe it's this very timidity has encouraged this strange liaison between the people who got us into this mess in the so-called free market system and the people who are suffering most from it. And it's based all on slogans appealing to the Constitution, the Founding Fathers, which have no logical connection with the issue. And I wonder how you're going to try to get out of this, because we're now in a situation, I think, analogous to what happened in the 1930s. And we're given a different name because everything is now light.
Yeah.
We don't have anything.
All right, let me try to, before you make this even harder, let me try to answer that question. Well, first of all, I think that somewhere in there you said something about timidity. Now, I actually put some thought into the speech I just gave you, and when I talked about this paragraph kind of at the end, and the proof is in the doing, stimulus that breaks economic free falls, saving 3.5 million jobs, teachers in the classroom, et cetera, education reform of, I think, some magnitude and certainly challenging interests along the way, tax cuts supporting, well, anyway, I won't go through it again, but if you think, healthcare reform, financial reg reform, the educational reform, the Recovery Act, I mean, this has been I think, a very far-reaching agenda. And you take the Recovery Act and you look at the oversight and the accountability that I cited with that tiny microcosmic fact. I think it's been an extremely bold agenda. David Leonhardt, who I think really plays it very straight down the middle, wrote an article in the New York Times a few months ago very much comparing this agenda to some of the points in history, and I mentioned FDR, to points in history where a truly new social contract is being crafted, and that's what I try to stress in my speech. Now, your comments are more of a kind of political nature. Why are people viewing this differently than they were in the 1930s? I'm probably not the right person to try to answer that. I will say again, kind of going into the microcosmic weeds, that if you ask people, I think there's some insight here, if you ask people, what do you think of the Recovery Act? Most of them are going to say, I didn't like it. Now, some of those think it was the TARP. You ask them about the TARP, they didn't like that. I can make a pretty good argument about how the TARP actually turned out to be an extremely efficient way to stabilize the financial system, but I'll put that aside. But if you actually ask people, what do you think about the teachers in the classroom, the projects fixing the roads, you ask them specifically the enhanced safety net, this polls in the 70 and 80%. So there's actually a great deal of support for, I think, what it is we're trying to do. If you ask people, this is kind of obvious, but you ask people, what do you think about insurance companies that have lifetime limits or won't cover pre-existing conditions? They don't like it. So, you know, a lot of this is noise created by, I think, a noise machine that didn't exist in the 1930s, that I think is in many ways blocking a signal. And when you add the fact, Robert Gibbs says this all the time, if you add the fact that the unemployment rate is 9.6%, it's awfully hard to message when folks are struggling like that. You know, could we have done a better job? I mean, the president himself talked about this in the Peter Baker piece a few weeks ago. I won't recount what he said, but I actually think that when I wrote this speech and the comments that I gave, I am clearly taking in these comments that I gave today, which are heartfelt, and I am clearly taking a longer view. Mm-hmm. And I think in the longer view, the people are with us.
Yeah, and I wouldn't disagree that it has been a very active time for the administration and for government. But there was a chart that Heidi put up first thing this morning. I think you're probably familiar with it. The 8 million job deficits that we're in,
yeah,
and the 3 million that we're behind. Heidi, here's the mic. Sorry, I didn't see you there. But
Heidi,
you know, I'll let her finish the question.
Heidi Scherhoff's former co-author and, you know, person I know well.
Yeah.
So where are those 11 million jobs going to come from?
There you go. Tag team.
By the way, the 11 million, just so people aren't confused, that's not the net job loss. Well, you explained it.
Yes, she did.
Oh,
she did.
You did explain it. Okay.
8 plus 3.
Right, 8 plus 3.
Right.
Excellent math over there at the Economic Policy Institute. The jobs have to come from where they always come from, and that's the private sector. I'm one of the, you know, I'm still, I realize, again, Heidi and I wrote books together, so, you know, but I'm still, David Kuznets, who used to work at the EPI with us, said that I was the most conservative person at EPI, so I'm not sure where that puts me. But at any rate, you know, I'm still very much a card-carrying economist in this view, and I happen to believe that if you actually get things working the way they're supposed to, you generate a lot of jobs in this country. And in fact, my best evidence for that is the 1990s. In the 1990s, where I would argue the social contract was much, much different than the one in the 2000s. And I'm not just saying, you know, this is not just a story of Clintonomics, although I think there were some very important advances made then. But that was a period where unemployment fell below 4% in a couple of months. In the year 2000. I think it went down as low as 3.8%. Something like 25 million jobs were created over that business cycle, compared to you know, a tiny fraction of that in the cycle of the 2000s. I think in the business cycle of the 2000s, something like 5 million. So, you know, if you actually get this right and you have this contract in place, the jobs will come from the sectors that generate that have generated the most jobs in the recent past. I actually think the BLS does a very good job on answering this question. It's like your question, which is a great question. You know, it tends to be a big mystery. Where are the jobs going to come from? With 2 mouse clicks, I can show you. Go to the BLS occupational projections and click on the table called, you know, where are the most jobs going to come from? And they have a list of, you know, 250 occupations. Now, here's the thing. They assume full employment. They assume an economy that's operating at full capacity. And they get robust job growth in exactly where you think. Now, some of these, by the way, and I think this is really important. You know, we tend to talk, and Heidi and the folks at EPI do a great job on this point. Not every one of these jobs happens to be, you know, a rocket scientist doubling as a, computer programmer. A lot of these jobs are home health aides, they're cashiers, they're folks driving their transportation, folks delivering goods, child care workers. If you look at the 10 occupations that are responsible for the largest amount of job growth, according to the BLS occupations, and they have a good BLS projection, they have a good record, you will find that the majority of them are middle to lower skilled jobs. So here you have an agenda that asks, you know, not just where are the jobs, but how are we going to make sure that those are good jobs, that those are living wage jobs, and that takes you to a different place. But I am firmly of the mindset that if we get in place the kind of contractual structure that I talked about in my speech, that this economy will generate a lot of jobs. I'll just say as a coda to this, we also, especially at a time like this when credit markets are still somewhat constrained and there are kind of investment externalities that maybe prevent venture capital from doing enough in new areas, we also have a real responsibility and an agenda to seed investments in new areas of job growth, to help people move from contracting sectors to expanding ones, to building transmissions for cars, to building transmissions to wind turbines. And I can take you through a set of programs that we are implementing as we speak, largely through the Recovery Act, but through other legislation as well, to do precisely that. So, you know, get your macroeconomy lined up, and I think, you know, look at the BLS projections and you'll see where the jobs are coming from, and at the same time try to make key seed investments to generate new growth.
One of the other ideas this morning was about infrastructure spending and different ways of mechanisms to finance it through infrastructure banks and others. You know, that obviously won't necessarily come even if the conditions return, and the public sector might have to play some role. What are your ideas about going back for additional infrastructure investment and other financing mechanisms?
I mean, infrastructure is always a great example where there are places, there are areas. I mean, even a you know, dyed-in-the-wool neoclassical economist will agree that there are areas where the private sector will underinvest in infrastructure, and there's a clear public role for that. And every 6 years or so, we actually authorize a very significant transportation bill to fund the nation's infrastructure. What the president has said is he'd like to get out in front of that with a $50 billion down payment to do two things: to kind of be the front vanguard of that larger transportation authorization bill that should happen in the next Congress, with a couple of again, seed investments in not just in sort of traditional infrastructure, roads and runways and railways, but in high-speed rail. In more innovative, integrated modes of transport, and I think very importantly, and I know New America has written very important stuff about this, perhaps through, through at least in part through a new decision and funding mechanism, an infrastructure bank. So you get away from so that you're much more rigorous in your cost-benefit analysis and your decision of what to fund, and so you have a portal for private capital to come in and work with us, to complement our seed capital. Here's a statistic you might not know: $100 billion of Recovery Act funding was complemented, leveraged up by $300 billion of non-federal funding. So, all this stuff about capital sitting on the sidelines, it's true. But if you provide an incentive and if you show the world that, you know, the big gorilla, the federal government, is interested in having a serious footprint in clean energy and high-speed rail and in smart investment, in health IT, in the smart grid, in advanced battery technology, you will bring in complementary investment to leverage that up. And we've seen that happen already.
Thank you. Yeah. This might be our final question here for Jared.
Hi, Jared. Karen Dolan, Institute for Policy Studies. And you mentioned earlier, Jared, referencing Sean Donovan and the housing policies and some good policies that they've put forward, and I agree to some extent, although last week there was a bit of a shake-up, at least from progressive circles, with some would say a thin argument from Sean Donovan about an opposition to foreclosure moratorium. And I wondered if you could comment on that, maybe thicken up the argument or offer another perspective, and just what you could say about the administration's opposition to moratorium on foreclosures. Thank you.
I think the concern there is, Karen, first of all, hi, Karen. Nice to see you. I used to see all my old friends much more often. I think there you have to ask yourself, can you achieve the goals that I articulated to Jamie a few minutes ago in terms of getting, making sure the system is, A, following the rule of law. I thought the Vice President put it well in an interview the other day, where he said, look, you make an agreement, you both sign something that says you're both going to do something. One person says they're going to pay their debts, and the other person says they're going to service their debts and do the relevant paperwork and verify that that paperwork is true. And if, in fact, that debt stops being serviced, then there are loss mitigation procedures that ought to be gone through. I think that we can accomplish getting that system back on track without a national moratorium, and that, I think that's what Sean was saying. It's not that we don't believe it's critical to review these systems and to get them functioning in, again, a trustworthy manner that we can believe in. It's a matter of, do we need to shut the system down to accomplish that? If you look at the controls, the internal controls that the FHA is implementing on the mortgages that they're responsible for, if you look at the task force that's engaged in the work that they're doing, the multifaceted task force, and then the Fed, yesterday announced that they're going to work with their regulators. I think our sense is that we can accomplish that goal without a national moratorium that, in our view, would be detrimental to carving out the bottom of the housing market that's essential to, I think, macroeconomic growth.
Thank you. Jared, thank you for joining us. Appreciated your comments.
Thank you.
And I'll just say, for more information on some of these issues and some papers and a webcast of this convening, you can go to our website, newamerica.net, and the conference is adjourned. Thank you.